There's something about being alone in the woods that makes you realize how fragile you really are. Out there, it's just you, no walls, no locks, no one to hear you if something goes wrong. I used to love that feeling. Now I can't even think about it without feeling the weight of it pressing down on my chest. I was never supposed to be out there for long, just a few days. It was October, the air was getting colder, and I wanted to squeeze in one last camping trip before winter. I picked a spot way out near the Cascade foothills, a place called Coyote Ridge. No official trails, no campsites. It was perfect. I loaded my pack, checked the weather, and headed out on a Friday morning. I told myself it was just going to be another trip. I was wrong. The first day felt normal. I parked at a dead-end logging road where the trees were so thick they cast long shadows even at noon. I hiked until my legs ached, until I was deep enough into the forest that I couldn't hear anything but the wind in the trees. By the time I set up camp near a creek, I was exhausted. I made a fire, ate, and watched the stars until my eyelids got heavy. I wasn't nervous. I'd done this a dozen times before. I zipped into my sleeping bag, let the sound of the creek lull me to sleep, and didn't think twice. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a snapping sound. It wasn't loud, just the crack of a branch breaking somewhere nearby. My first thought was a deer, maybe a raccoon. The woods are full of noises at night. I lay there for a while, listening. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint light on the trees. The creek gurgled softly. Then I heard it again. A branch breaking, closer this time. I sat up, holding my breath. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was nothing. Still, I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I scanned the trees. Nothing. No movement. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I shook it off. Maybe it was an animal. I packed up camp and kept hiking deeper into the woods. The air was colder than it had been the day before. The sky was overcast, the light muted. I could barely hear the birds. By late afternoon, I found another good spot to camp. Flat ground, plenty of firewood, and far enough from the creek that I wouldn't wake up freezing. I made a fire as the sun started to set. The flames crackled in the quiet, the smoke curling up into the trees. That's when I found the rope. It was tied to a low branch about 20 feet from my camp, just hanging there, old, frayed, like it had been there a while. At first, I thought maybe it was from another camper, but the knot was too neat. Perfect, like someone knew what they were doing. Something about it didn't feel right. I pulled it down and threw it into the fire. I told myself I was overthinking it. That night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't branches breaking. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I lay there frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I gripped my knife, holding my breath. The footsteps would move, stop, then start again. They weren't panicked. They weren't wandering. They were searching. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't. My mouth was dry, my hands shaking. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. The steps circled my tent twice more, then stopped. Silence. I waited until the sun came up before I moved. When I crawled out of my tent, I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. Heavy boots, fresh. They led from the trees, circled my camp, and disappeared back into the woods. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I started hiking back the way I came, but something was different. The woods felt wrong. The trail I had followed the day before looked unfamiliar. The trees pressed in closer. I felt like I was walking in circles, even though I knew I was heading the right way. Then I saw the rope again. Same knot, same branch. I ripped it down and kept walking. I walked until my legs were on fire, until the sun started to sink low. I hadn't seen a single familiar landmark. No creek, no trail markers, nothing. By the time the light started to fade, I knew I wasn't getting out that day. I found a spot where the trees were thick enough to block the wind and set up camp. I was shaking as I lit the fire, my breath coming in short bursts. I kept my knife in my hand, staring at the woods, waiting. It didn't take long. I saw the light first, a flashlight moving slowly between the trees. No voice, no footsteps, just the light, scanning the woods like someone was searching for something. Or someone. I killed my fire, sat there in the dark, heart hammering. The light moved closer. I could hear the branches crackling under their boots now. Slow, steady. They were in no hurry. I waited until the light moved past. Then I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I crashed through the trees, branches cutting my arms, my legs burning. I could still see the light behind me moving calmly, like they knew I wasn't getting far. I kept running until I hit water, a wide creek I didn't recognize. My legs were shaking, my breath ragged. I waded across, freezing water soaking me to the waist. I could hear them behind me now, not running, just walking. On the other side of the creek, I crouched low behind a fallen log. I could barely breathe. The light reached the edge of the water. It stopped. I could see the beam scanning the trees. Slowly, methodically, then it clicked off. Silence. I sat there until the sun started to rise, my clothes soaked, my body numb. When I finally stood, I didn't see anyone. I kept walking until I hit a trail I recognized. When I reached my car, I locked the doors before I even started it. I drove until I hit cell service and called the ranger station. I tried to explain what happened, but they just told me no one else had been in that area for weeks. I never found out who it was or why they were out there, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I still hear those footsteps, and I wonder if they ever stopped following me. I've always been comfortable in the woods. I grew up around them, spent my childhood climbing trees and learning how to track deer trails with my dad. By the time I was old enough to go camping alone, I felt like I knew the forest better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. I never thought I had anything to fear out there. That changed last summer. I'd taken a week off work to clear my head. Life was wearing me down. Too many hours at the office, too many people always wanting something. I needed to unplug. The plan was simple. Hike into the deep woods, camp for 5 days, and forget the world existed. I chose an area in northern Washington, a stretch of forest miles from any town. No cell service, no people, exactly what I needed. The first day was perfect. I parked at the trailhead and hiked until my legs burned. By evening, I found a clearing next to a creek, set up my tent, and got a fire going before the sun dipped behind the trees. The air smelled like pine and smoke. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the rush of water over rocks. I felt calm for the first time in weeks. That calm didn't last. On the second day, I hiked deeper. I kept off the main trail, following a game path that wound through dense pines. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots crunching over dead leaves. By late afternoon, I found another spot to camp, a flat stretch of ground near a ridge. I set up camp quickly. There was no reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't shake it. As I gathered firewood, I noticed something strange. The trees around my camp were marked. Thin slashes in the bark about shoulder height. Not natural, not from animals. They were deliberate, like someone had taken a knife and cut shallow grooves. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe a hunter marked the trees. Maybe it was old. I finished stacking firewood, lit the fire, and tried to focus on relaxing. That night, I woke up to the sound of something moving. I sat up fast, heart pounding. The fire was just glowing coals now, casting faint light around the campsite. I listened. At first, there was nothing, just the wind in the trees. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, not an animal. Heavy, slow. They moved just beyond the light of the fire, circling my camp. My mouth went dry. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, but I didn't call out. I just listened, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The footsteps kept circling, slow, steady, deliberate. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside my tent. The ground was damp with dew, and there, in the dirt, were footprints. Big ones, heavy boots. They circled my tent. I packed up fast. I told myself I'd hike to another spot, maybe closer to the main trail. I didn't want to turn back. Not yet. I just wanted to put some distance between me and whoever that was. By noon, I'd made it to another ridge. I stopped to catch my breath, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing moved. I told myself it was fine. Then I saw it. Another tree, another set of slashes. Fresh this time, sap still running down the bark. Someone was following me, marking where I camped. I started walking faster. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just wanted to keep moving. The further I went, the thicker the woods got. The trees closed in tight, blocking out the sun. My breath came faster. My legs burned. I kept thinking I'd hear those footsteps again. I found another clearing by late afternoon. I didn't want to stop, but my legs were shaking so badly I had to rest. I built another fire, bigger this time, and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone was out here hunting. Maybe I was letting my mind get away from me. That night, the footsteps came back. They were closer this time. I lay in my tent, knife in my hand, listening as they circled the camp again and again. Slow, calm, like they had all the time in the world. I thought about running, but where would I go? The woods were thick. I'd never make it far in the dark. I stayed up all night again. When morning finally came, I found something new. Not just footprints this time. A bundle of sticks tied together with twine, lying right outside my tent. I didn't touch it. I packed my gear and started moving. I wasn't hiking anymore, I was running. I followed the ridge, trying to head back toward the trailhead. The woods felt different now. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the trees were holding their breath. By midday, I realized I was lost. The ridge sloped down into thick forest, and every direction looked the same. I checked my map, but nothing matched up. No landmarks, no creek, no way to tell which way was out. And then I saw the rope. It was tied to a tree about 50 feet ahead. A thick, rough rope hanging from a high branch. I stopped cold. My skin crawled. I looked around, heart pounding. I didn't see anyone. I kept walking faster now. 10 minutes later, another rope. Different tree. They were leading me somewhere. I turned and started running. I didn't care where I ended up. I just wanted to get out. The woods blurred around me, branches tearing at my clothes, my breath ragged. I kept thinking I'd hear footsteps behind me, but I never did. Then I found the cabin. It was small, barely standing, the wood gray with age. No windows, just a single door hanging open. I didn't go inside. I kept running. By some miracle, I found the main trail an hour later. When I reached my car, I locked the doors before I even started the engine. I drove until I hit the next town, shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I don't know who it was. I don't know why they were out there, but sometimes I wonder if they ever stopped following me. I've spent most of my life outdoors. I'm not some survivalist or anything, but I know my way around the woods. I know how to navigate without a phone, how to track the weather by the clouds, how to listen for the sound of water when you run out. I've been hiking and camping alone for years. There's a calm you get out there that's hard to find anywhere else. But the woods are only peaceful when you feel in control. Once you lose that, once you realize how small you really are, they become something else entirely. That's what happened to me last fall. I had a 4-day weekend off work, so I packed up and drove to Blackwood Forest, a stretch of thick timberland way up north near the Canadian border. It's not the kind of place with a bunch of marked trails or campsites. The only people who go out there are hunters or guys like me who want to get away from everything. I parked at the end of a logging road where the gravel just kind of dissolves into dirt. It was mid-October, cold enough to see my breath, but not cold enough to freeze. Perfect weather for hiking. I loaded up my pack, checked my compass, and headed in. The first day was easy. I followed a ridgeline until I found a good spot to camp near a small stream. It was quiet out there. No planes overhead, no sounds of traffic. I made a fire, ate, and sat under the stars until I got tired. Nothing felt off. It was the kind of night you hope for when you camp. The next morning, I packed up and kept going deeper. The trail wasn't really a trail at that point. just a game path cutting through the trees. I made good time, stopping once to fill my water bottle at another stream. By the time the sun started dropping, I'd covered about 10 miles. I found another clearing to set up camp. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. There was an old hunting stand about 30 feet up a tree at the edge of the clearing. It looked like it had been there for years. The wood warped, the nails rusted. But there was something weird about it. There were fresh rope marks on the trunk, like someone had climbed it recently. I'm not paranoid, but it bugged me. Blackwood is huge. You can hike for days without seeing another person. The fact that someone had been here recently, climbing an old stand in the middle of nowhere, I don't know, it just didn't sit right. I tried to ignore it. I set up my tent, got the fire going, and settled in for the night. The air was cold and still, the kind of quiet where you can hear the trees creaking in the breeze. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, starting to drift off. Then I heard it. A single snap, not close but not far either. Just one sharp crack like a heavy branch breaking underfoot. I sat up, heart pounding. I listened for a while, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just the wind moving through the trees. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a branch falling. It happens all the time, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I packed up and kept moving. The woods felt different, though, heavier. The kind of silence where it feels like something is listening. I hiked for hours trying to shake the feeling. By the afternoon, I came across another clearing. That's when I saw it. A deer carcass. It was fresh, no more than a day old, lying right in the middle of the clearing. But it wasn't torn apart. It was gutted, clean, like someone had killed it with a knife. The body was laid out neatly, the legs straight, the head turned slightly to the side. Hunters don't do that. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I looked around, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anyone. The woods were silent. I took a picture on my phone just in case and kept walking. I should have turned back. By evening, I found another spot to camp. I was exhausted, but my nerves were shot. I built the fire bigger than I normally would, just to feel a little safer. The sun went down, and I sat there staring into the flames, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from the trees behind me. I froze. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the firelight. I stared into the dark, but I couldn't see anyone. No flashlight, no breathing. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. Finally, I got up, grabbed my knife, and slowly backed into my tent. I didn't sleep. I just sat there holding the knife, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to sunlight filtering through the tent. I scrambled out and checked the campsite. That's when I saw the footprints. They were in the dirt, circling the fire pit. Big, heavy boot prints. Not mine. I packed up and started hiking back the way I came. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. I just wanted out. I kept checking over my shoulder, but I didn't see anyone. I hiked hard all day, covering twice the distance I normally would. By late afternoon, I realized something was wrong. The ridge I had followed in looked different. The trees didn't match. I wasn't on the same path. Somehow, I had gotten turned around, even though I had been following my compass. I found another old hunting stand around sunset. This one was newer. There was a backpack hanging from one of the rungs, worn and weathered from the rain. I climbed up and unzipped it. Inside, there was a rope, duct tape, a folding knife, and a Polaroid picture of me. It was from the first night I camped, taken from the edge of the firelight. My hands started shaking. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I threw the bag down and started running. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, then I kept going. By some miracle, I found a road by nightfall. I flagged down the first truck I saw and never looked back. I gave the picture to the police. They checked the woods, but they never found anyone. I still go hiking. I still camp. But now, when the sun goes down, I always make sure I'm not alone, because I know someone else is out there, and they don't stop watching. I've been hunting for as long as I can remember. My dad took me into the woods before I could even hold a rifle, teaching me how to track, how to listen, how to read the forest. I was comfortable out there. I thought I understood it. I thought nothing could really scare me. I was wrong. Last October, I took a trip to the Pine Barrens in southern New Jersey. It's not the kind of place most people think about when they imagine deep woods, but trust me, once you get far enough in, it feels like another world. Thick pines in every direction, sandy soil that muffles your footsteps, and so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. No cell service, no trails, just miles of forest. I planned to spend 3 days out there, hunting deer and camping under the stars. I parked at a dirt road entrance and hiked in about 10 miles the first day. I had my pack, my rifle, and enough supplies to last a week if I needed it. I wasn't worried about anything. By the time the sun started going down, I found a good spot near a shallow creek. I set up camp, got a fire going, and cooked some canned food. The night was cold, but the fire kept me warm. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet I'd grown up with. Just the crackle of the fire, the rustling of leaves, the occasional owl. Nothing out of the ordinary. I slept fine that first night. The second day, I started hunting. I hiked up along a ridge where I'd seen some deer sign the day before. Tracks in the mud, some fresh droppings. I was sure I'd find something, but the woods felt different. I noticed it around mid-morning. The birds stopped making noise. No squirrels moving through the brush. The air felt heavy, like before a thunderstorm. I figured maybe there was a predator nearby, a coyote or something. It happens. I kept moving. By noon, I still hadn't seen a single animal. No deer, no birds, nothing. That never happens. The Pine Barrens are full of wildlife, even if you're not looking for it. I sat down to eat, and that's when I found it. A deer carcass. It was lying in the grass about 50 yards from where I was sitting. Fresh kill, but it wasn't eaten. Its throat was cut clean, not torn. No bite marks, no struggle. Just a deep, precise cut, like someone had used a blade. I stared at it for a long time. I've gutted enough animals to know what it looks like when something's killed for food. This wasn't that. This was something else. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I checked the ground around me, looking for tracks. I found boot prints, big ones, the kind you'd get from heavy hunting boots. They weren't mine. I told myself it was probably another hunter. Maybe they left it for some reason. But why kill a deer and not take the meat? None of it made sense. I should have turned back right then. I didn't. I packed up and kept moving, telling myself I was overthinking it. I hiked for another few hours, circling back toward my camp. The woods were still quiet, too quiet. As the sun started setting, I reached the ridge above my campsite. That's when I saw the smoke, a thin trail of it rising through the trees. My stomach dropped. I started moving fast, rifle in hand. I kept low, staying quiet. When I got close enough to see the camp, my blood went cold. The fire was burning, my fire, but I hadn't lit it. My tent was still there. My gear was untouched, but someone had been there. Recently, I crouched in the trees for what felt like hours, watching the camp. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anyone. Finally, I moved in. The fire was still warm. Someone had lit it maybe 10, 15 minutes before I got there. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing. My rifle was still loaded. My food was untouched. But there was something new. In the dirt near the fire, someone had left a single shotgun shell. It wasn't mine. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with my rifle across my lap, eyes scanning the dark. The woods were silent. No wind, no animals, just the crackle of the fire. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from the trees. I turned off the headlamp I was wearing and sat perfectly still. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever it was would hear it. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the firelight. I could barely breathe. Whoever it was, they just stood there, watching. I raised my rifle, heart hammering in my chest. I waited for something, anything, to move. but nothing did. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, slow and steady, walking away into the dark. I stayed up until dawn, rifle in hand, eyes burning. When the sun finally rose, I packed up and started hiking out. I didn't care about hunting anymore. I just wanted to get back to my truck. But the whole way back, I kept finding those boot prints. Sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind. They weren't mine. The worst part, I never saw who made them. I got back to my truck by late afternoon. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, but there was never anyone there. When I finally made it home, I checked the news. No missing person reports. No hunters found in the woods. Nothing. I don't know who it was. I don't know why they were out there, but I know one thing. They were hunting something, and I think it was me. It was supposed to be just a short hike. I had packed light, a water bottle, a small bag of trail mix, my phone. Just in case, though I didn't think I would need it. My intention was simple: to enjoy a quiet walk through the forest, clear my mind, and return before dark. I had done this many times before. I knew the trail well. It was a loop, after all. I'd be out and back in a couple of hours. But somehow I lost the path. It started innocently enough. The forest was thick, but not so dense that I couldn't see where I was going. The trees towered over me, their branches whispering in the wind, and the smell of pine was thick in the air. I kept moving, my boots crunching against the dry leaves beneath my feet. The weather had been unpredictable that week. Mild one day, then a storm the next, but today was perfect. The sun filtered through the canopy in beams, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Felt peaceful. Too peaceful, I thought later, but at that moment it just felt right. I followed the trail for what seemed like miles, but at some point, the markings on the trees that were supposed to guide me started to fade. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. I assumed I was just being paranoid. I'd hiked this trail countless times, and it always looped back around. That's what they told me when I first came here. The trail was foolproof. Then it wasn't. I looked around, the trees growing denser, the shadows longer. My mind started to race. The trail should have been here. The familiar path, the markers, the way the ground dipped at the creek. But all I saw was thick brush and the occasional fallen tree. I backtracked, hoping to find a familiar landmark, but everything was unfamiliar. I pulled out my phone. No service. Not that I expected it. This area was known for poor reception, but it gave me a sinking feeling. The trail had vanished, or perhaps I had simply lost it. And now I was somewhere deep in the woods, and no one knew where I was. My stomach twisted. I tried to keep calm. This wasn't the first time I had gotten off track. I had wandered off the trail before. All I needed to do was backtrack. I looked around. The trees were so dense I could barely see beyond 10 feet. I tried to retrace my steps, walking slowly, scanning the ground for any signs of the path. My feet crunched through the leaves, each step echoing too loudly in my ears. I turned in circles, starting to feel disoriented. The woods had a strange quiet to them now. I couldn't hear the usual hum of insects or the occasional call of a bird. It was almost unnerving, just the rustle of my boots on the leaves, and that was it. The silence pressed in on me. I walked for what felt like hours, though I couldn't be sure. It was hard to keep track of time in the woods, especially when it was just me and the trees. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that the trail was nearby and I would find it soon. I tried to tell myself to stay calm, but that became harder with each passing minute. The wind had picked up, now swirling around me, making the trees creak and groan as if they were watching me. Eventually, I came to a clearing. At first, I thought I had found something, maybe a hidden path or a marker, but it was just a small, wide-open space surrounded by thick trees. The ground was soft, the dirt dark and damp from a recent rain. I stopped, squinting into the distance. There was no sign of a trail, no sign of anything familiar, just trees, some dead and others alive, their branches reaching out like arms. I took a deep breath. Panic started creeping up my spine. I couldn't stay here, not in this strange place. My feet moved without thinking, pushing me forward, hoping that I would find the trail again. I had to. I couldn't stay out here, not alone, not with no idea of how far I had wandered. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt colder now, even though the sun was still up. The trees were closer together, their branches tangled, almost blocking out the light. The further I went, the more the world seemed to shrink around me. The woods felt like they were closing in, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the thick underbrush. My heart began to race. I stopped. This wasn't right. I had to be lost, but I refused to admit it. Instead, I forced myself to keep moving. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow maybe, but when I looked again, I saw something moving between the trees. It was quick, too quick for an animal. The movement was sharp, almost deliberate. I froze, staring at the spot where I had seen the motion. My breath hitched. The silence was crushing. Nothing. I waited, straining my ears, my eyes, but there was no sound, no movement. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I turned away and continued walking, but my thoughts were racing. Was someone else out here with me? Was I just imagining things? I took another few steps, but that's when I heard it, the unmistakable snap of a twig behind me. My stomach dropped. I spun around, heart pounding. There was nothing there, not even a breeze to shake the branches. I stood there for a moment, frozen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was just out of sight, waiting. I forced myself to breathe, focus, stay calm. I told myself I had to get out. I couldn't stay here, not in this growing panic. I started walking faster now, my eyes scanning the trees, the underbrush, but everything looked the same. Trees, leaves, dirt, everything seemed to blur together. I tried to remember the way I had come, but the more I thought about it, the more uncertain I became. My feet felt heavier with each step, and the world around me seemed to grow darker. Then I saw it again, a figure. This time I was sure of it. It was standing between two trees, just barely visible through the thick trunks. It was tall, too tall for any normal person, its body dark against the shadows of the forest. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. My feet pounded the ground, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The woods blurred by me as I sprinted, branches slapping against my arms, my chest tightening with panic. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to get away. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs ached, and my mind screamed at me to stop. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for air. Sweat soaked my clothes. My hands were shaking. I didn't know where I was, but I knew I couldn't stay there. My mind was foggy with fear, and I couldn't focus. I looked around. The forest seemed endless now, the trees stretching out in every direction. I wanted to call out, but I knew no one would hear me. There was no one out here. It was just me, alone in the woods, and whatever was following me. I knew it was still out there. I could feel it. It was waiting, watching. My mind spun with terror. I had to make it out. I had to find the way back. I took another breath and forced myself to move. Every step felt heavier than the last, and I no longer cared about the trail. I didn't care about the time. I didn't care about anything except escaping. The woods were closing in. I could feel them closing in around me, suffocating me. And then, finally, I saw it. The edge of the forest. The trees parted, and I stumbled into a small clearing. My heart leaped into my throat when I saw the faint outline of a road in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was a road. It was something, a way out. I ran toward it, my legs burning, my body shaking with exhaustion. I didn't look back. I didn't care what was behind me anymore. I just had to get to the road. When I finally reached it, I collapsed to the ground. I was out. I was free. The woods were behind me and I was safe. I sat there for a while, catching my breath. The air felt cooler now, but I didn't care. I was too relieved to feel anything else. I pulled out my phone, finally able to check the time. It was late, far later than I thought. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I couldn't help but think how close I had come to never making it out. I never did figure out what I saw out there in the woods. Was it another person or something else? I don't know, but I do know one thing. I will never go back there again. Hiking solo had always been my thing. I don't know why. Maybe it was just easier to be alone. No one to keep pace with, no one to talk to. Just me, the trail, and the rhythm of my own breathing. I never thought much about safety. I figured if you stuck to the plan, carried the right gear, and didn't do anything stupid, you'd be fine. I know better now. It was late summer when I decided to take on Black Ridge Trail, the kind of trail that doesn't get a lot of foot traffic. 20 miles of steep switchbacks, narrow ridges, and long stretches where you don't see another person for hours. It wasn't well marked, but that was part of the appeal. I liked the challenge. I liked the quiet. I started early, just after sunrise. The trailhead was empty, no cars, no people. The first few miles were easy enough. Wide path, gentle incline, just the sound of my boots on dirt and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. By noon, I was about 10 miles in. I stopped to drink some water and check the map. I wanted to push a little further before turning back. The trail was supposed to loop at the summit. I figured I'd make it there by mid-afternoon, then head back down before dark. But something felt off. It started with the markers, the little orange tags they nail to trees to keep you on track. I stopped seeing them. I didn't panic right away. It happens sometimes. You zone out, miss a turn. I backtracked a bit, scanning the trees. Nothing. I pulled out my map, but it wasn't much help. It was an old paper map, creased and faded. The kind they hand out at the ranger station for free. I traced the path with my finger, trying to figure out where I went wrong. But the more I looked, the more I realized I wasn't sure where I was at all. That's when I noticed the silence. When you're in the woods, there's always some noise. Birds, insects, wind moving through the trees. But now it was dead quiet. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the animals were just further up the trail. I kept walking, looking for the next marker. But the longer I walked, the more things felt wrong. The trees started to change. They got closer together, branches tangled low like they were trying to block the light. The dirt path turned rougher, with roots twisting up through the ground. I hadn't seen another person all day, but I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I stopped to catch my breath and looked around. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They were in the dirt just ahead of me. Fresh, deep, bare feet, but large, bigger than mine. The toes were splayed wide, like whoever made them was walking slowly. Deliberately, my stomach dropped. I crouched down, touching the edge of one print. The dirt was still soft. Whoever made them hadn't been there long. I glanced around the trees, heart pounding, but I didn't see anyone. I thought about turning back, but I didn't want to panic. I told myself it could have been anyone. A hiker who lost their boots, a swimmer from the river nearby. Weird, but not impossible. I kept walking. Another mile passed, and I saw more prints. This time they were off the trail, weaving through the trees. Same size, same slow, heavy steps. I followed them for a bit, just out of curiosity. They led to a small clearing with a fire pit in the center. The fire was out, but the ashes were still warm. I felt my chest tighten. Someone had been there recently. I walked around the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of where they went. That's when I noticed something hanging from the trees. A jacket, faded, torn at the sleeves, dangling from a low branch like someone had just thrown it there. I walked closer and reached up to touch it. The fabric was damp. That's when I smelled it. Sweat, faint but unmistakable. Whoever had been wearing the jacket hadn't been gone long. My skin started to crawl. I backed away, heart pounding. I wanted to call out, ask if anyone was there, but something stopped me. I left the clearing and got back on the trail. I wasn't running, but I was moving fast. The sky was starting to turn that deep gray color that comes before sunset. I had a couple of hours of daylight left, but I knew I needed to head back. I made it about a mile before I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another fire pit. Same setup. Same ashes. Still warm. It didn't make sense. I hadn't taken any turns. I was sure I was heading back the way I came. But here it was the same fire pit. The same clearing. The same jacket. I stood there for a long time, my breath coming in short gasps. My chest felt tight. My legs felt heavy. I told myself it was just a mistake. Maybe I'd gotten turned around somehow. Maybe I'd walked in a loop. I checked my phone. No signal. No GPS. I decided to keep moving. Fast. The sun was low now, turning the trees dark. My flashlight was in my pack, but I didn't want to stop to get it. I just wanted to get out. I kept walking, but the trail didn't look familiar anymore. The trees were too close. The ground was rougher. I was breathing hard now, my legs burning. My whole body was screaming to run, but I didn't want to panic. I just kept walking. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping. Close. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. The shadows were long now, stretching across the ground. I thought I saw something move, just a shape low to the ground, but it was too dark to tell. I didn't wait to find out. I started running. My pack bounced hard against my back, my breath ragged in my chest. I wasn't even looking at the trail anymore, just moving forward, trying to put as much distance between me and whatever was out there. I tripped twice, once hard enough to tear my knee open on a rock. I didn't stop. When I finally saw the parking lot through the trees, I almost cried. My truck was there, the only vehicle left. I sprinted to it, threw my pack in the back, and locked the doors. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I noticed something on the windshield. A handprint, smudged, bare, big enough to cover the entire glass. I didn't wait to think about it. I started the engine and drove. I haven't been back since, and I never will. By the time dawn broke, I was running on fumes. My entire body ached, and my mind felt foggy from the lack of sleep. I packed up my tent with numb hands, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I decided to keep moving downhill. Water usually led to civilization, or at least a more familiar trail. But the further I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees were thicker, the underbrush tangled and unforgiving. I tripped more than once, scraping my hands raw on the rocks and dirt. Around midday, I found another sign that I wasn't the first person to get lost out here. A jacket hung from a low branch, faded and torn, with one sleeve missing. It looked like it had been there for months, maybe longer. I checked the pockets, hoping for some clue, a map, anything. Empty. I kept moving. The hours dragged by. My water was running low again, and my legs felt like lead. I was too tired to be scared anymore. I just wanted to find a way out. But the woods had other plans. I stumbled upon another campsite just before dusk, and this one was worse than the last. The tent was collapsed like before, but the sleeping bag was still inside, half unzipped. There was food scattered across the ground, some of it still in sealed packets. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave all this behind? I checked the bag for any identification, but there was nothing. No wallet, no phone. Just clothes and supplies, as if the person had stepped out for a minute and never came back. That's when I heard it. A low, distant whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. It was human. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst. I waited, breath held, but the whistle didn't come again. I packed up as fast as I could and kept walking, even though my body screamed at me to rest. As night fell, the woods came alive with sounds I couldn't explain. Footsteps in the brush, branches breaking in the distance. Always just far enough that I couldn't be sure. I told myself it was animals, but deep down I knew better. I don't know how I made it through that night. By the time the sun rose again, I was delirious. My vision blurred at the edges, and I was barely putting one foot in front of the other. But I kept going. I had to. When I finally stumbled onto a dirt road, I nearly cried. It wasn't the trail I had come in on, but I didn't care. I followed it until I reached a small, rundown cabin. The windows were boarded up, and there was no car in sight, but it didn't matter. I banged on the door anyway. No answer. I kept walking. Another hour passed before I finally heard the distant rumble of an engine. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms like a madman. The truck driver who picked me up looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was. I never told him what I saw. I just asked him to take me back to town. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I don't go into the woods anymore. I can't. Because sometimes at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I can still hear that whistle. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who got lost in the woods. I was the kind who always played it safe. Double-checked my gear, told someone where I was going, stuck to the trails. I wasn't some overconfident idiot charging into the wilderness with nothing but a bottle of water and a pocket knife. I did things by the book, but none of that mattered when things went wrong. It was supposed to be a quick trip, just 2 days in and out. The kind of trip where you decompress from work, clear your head, and come back feeling better. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, years ago. Deep woods, a few hours north, but nothing crazy. Just quiet. That's all I wanted. I drove out early, parked at the trailhead, and started walking. The first day went fine. I made it to the spot I had in mind, near a stream with soft ground for the tent. I spent the evening just sitting by the water, listening to the woods settle as the sun went down. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. I even took a picture of the sunset to prove to myself later that I'd finally relaxed. The next morning, I decided to push a little further. I had the whole day to kill, and the map showed another stream a few miles out. I figured I'd make it there by noon, have lunch, then loop back to camp. I packed light, left most of my gear at the site, and started walking. By late morning, things started feeling off. The trail was rougher than I remembered, and the trees seemed closer together. I checked the map again, but it didn't make sense. I should have hit the stream by now. I kept going, thinking maybe I had just misread the distance. When I finally heard running water, it wasn't the stream I was expecting. It was smaller, barely more than a trickle, and the water was dark with mud. I filled my bottle anyway, filtering it through my pump. That was the first time I felt it, that weird, sinking feeling in my chest, like I was being watched. I brushed it off. The woods mess with your head when you're alone. I told myself that. I kept moving. An hour later, I was still walking. The trees were thicker now, the light dim even though it was still early afternoon. My phone had no signal. I wasn't panicking yet, but I was starting to get frustrated. I should have turned back, but I kept thinking the trail had to be close. That was when I found the backpack. It was just lying there in the middle of a clearing, faded, torn, covered in leaves like it had been there for months. I unzipped it, half expecting to find nothing, but it was full of gear. Food, a water bottle, a map. The map was torn in half. I don't know why, but that made my stomach turn. I checked the food. It was expired by years. The water bottle was still half full. I put it down and kept walking, faster now. By the time I realized I was walking in circles, the sun was starting to go down. I recognized the same fallen tree I'd passed earlier, the same rock formation. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, but I knew I wasn't. I set up camp before it got dark. I didn't have a tent, just a tarp and my sleeping bag. I built a fire, but it felt like the light didn't go far enough. The trees crowded in, their shadows long and sharp. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing things. Footsteps, slow and steady, moving through the brush, not crashing like a deer or a bear, just walking. I sat up, knife in my hand, but I never saw anything. I told myself it was just my head playing tricks on me. By morning, I was exhausted, but I kept moving. I tried going back the way I came, but the trail was gone. It didn't make sense. I had marked trees with my knife as I walked, but they were gone. Or maybe I just couldn't find them. I don't know. I walked all day, following the sun, hoping it would lead me out. I found more signs of people. A rusted canteen, a jacket hanging from a branch, a shoe half buried in the mud. It felt like I was walking through a graveyard of people who had tried to leave before me. That night, I built another fire. It didn't help. The footsteps came back, closer this time. I could hear breathing, slow and heavy. I sat with my back to a tree, knife clutched so tight my hand cramped. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just sat there, shaking, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. By morning, I was barely holding it together. My water was almost gone, and I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, just trying to survive. When I finally stumbled onto the dirt road, I nearly collapsed. I flagged down the first car I saw, some old pickup with a man who looked as tired as I felt. I didn't tell him what happened. I just asked him to take me to the nearest town. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't think I ever will, because sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I still hear footsteps outside my window. Slow, steady, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a few days out in the woods to clear my head. I've always found something calming about being deep in the trees, far away from the hum of traffic and the buzz of my phone. The older I got, the more I felt like I needed that kind of peace. So I packed light but smart, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water purifier, and a good knife. I didn't even tell many people where I was going, just my brother and a friend, and they didn't ask for details. It was the kind of trip where I wanted to disappear for a little while. I parked my truck at the trailhead, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The forest was thick out there, with old-growth trees towering overhead and a floor of ferns and moss that swallowed every footstep. It wasn't one of those well-maintained trails where you run into someone every half mile. This was out in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where you could walk all day and not see another person. The first day was good. I made it about 10 miles in before I set up camp near a small creek. The water was cold and clean, and I felt good, tired in the way that makes sleep come easy. I built a small fire, cooked some instant rice and tuna, and sat there watching the flames until the stars came out. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you forget exists when you live in the city. I remember thinking how nice it was, how peaceful. That night, though, I woke up to a noise. Not a loud noise, just something. I couldn't place it at first. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. It wasn't an animal. I know what animals sound like. I've camped enough times to tell the difference. This was softer, like footsteps, but not quite. Like something moving through the brush, but trying not to be heard. I sat up slowly, my heart beating harder than it should have been. I unzipped the tent quietly and peered out. The fire was just glowing embers by then, casting a faint orange light on the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, thick and heavy in the air. I got out of the tent, grabbed my flashlight, and swept it across the trees. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I walked a slow circle around the campsite, listening. The woods felt too quiet. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I packed up and kept moving deeper into the woods. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but I kept looking over my shoulder. I wasn't hearing things, though. Every now and then, I'd catch it again, that faint, almost imperceptible sound of something moving when I stopped walking. I started to feel like I was being followed. By the time I set up camp that night, I was tired but wired. My legs ached from hiking all day, but my mind wouldn't shut off. I built another fire, bigger this time. Something about the light made me feel safer. I sat there for a long time, staring into the flames, listening. And then I heard it again, closer this time. I stood up, holding the flashlight tight in one hand and my knife in the other. I called out, but my voice just fell flat against the trees. Nothing answered. I walked to the edge of the campsite, shining the light into the woods. The beam caught movement for just a second, a shape slipping behind a tree. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. I wanted to call out again, but something stopped me. My gut told me not to. I just backed away slowly, never turning my back on the trees, and sat by the fire again. I kept the knife in my hand, the flashlight in my lap. I sat there for hours listening. At some point, exhaustion won. I dozed off without meaning to. When I woke up, the fire was almost out, and the woods were dark. I sat up fast, heart pounding, but the forest was silent. Too silent. That was when I noticed the footprints, just outside the ring of light from the fire. Bare footprints, deep enough to show the weight of someone heavy. They circled my campsite, once, twice, and then they disappeared back into the woods. I packed up at first light. I wasn't going to stay another night out there. I took a different trail back, moving fast. I wanted to put as much distance as I could between me and whoever had been out there. But the whole way back, I kept hearing it. That faint sound of someone moving in the brush, always just out of sight. It followed me all the way to the trailhead. When I finally made it back to my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. I didn't see anyone on the road out. No cars, no people. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know this, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't my imagination. I haven't been back since. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a few days out in the woods to clear my head. I've always found something calming about being deep in the trees, far away from the hum of traffic and the buzz of my phone. The older I got, the more I felt like I needed that kind of peace. So I packed light but smart, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water purifier, and a good knife. I didn't even tell many people where I was going, just my brother and a friend, and they didn't ask for details. It was the kind of trip where I wanted to disappear for a little while. I parked my truck at the trailhead, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The forest was thick out there, with old-growth trees towering overhead and a floor of ferns and moss that swallowed every footstep. It wasn't one of those well-maintained trails where you run into someone every half mile. This was out in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where you could walk all day and not see another person. The first day was good. I made it about 10 miles in before I set up camp near a small creek. The water was cold and clean, and I felt good, tired in the way that makes sleep come easy. I built a small fire, cooked some instant rice and tuna, and sat there watching the flames until the stars came out. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you forget exists when you live in the city. I remember thinking how nice it was, how peaceful. That night, though, I woke up to a noise. Not a loud noise, just something. I couldn't place it at first. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. It wasn't an animal. I know what animals sound like. I've camped enough times to tell the difference. This was softer, like footsteps, but not quite. Like something moving through the brush, but trying not to be heard. I sat up slowly, my heart beating harder than it should have been. I unzipped the tent quietly and peered out. The fire was just glowing embers by then, casting a faint orange light on the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, thick and heavy in the air. I got out of the tent, grabbed my flashlight, and swept it across the trees. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I walked a slow circle around the campsite, listening. The woods felt too quiet. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I packed up and kept moving deeper into the woods. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but I kept looking over my shoulder. I wasn't hearing things, though. Every now and then, I'd catch it again, that faint, almost imperceptible sound of something moving when I stopped walking. I started to feel like I was being followed. By the time I set up camp that night, I was tired but wired. My legs ached from hiking all day, but my mind wouldn't shut off. I built another fire, bigger this time. Something about the light made me feel safer. I sat there for a long time, staring into the flames, listening. And then I heard it again, closer this time. I stood up, holding the flashlight tight in one hand and my knife in the other. I called out, but my voice just fell flat against the trees. Nothing answered. I walked to the edge of the campsite, shining the light into the woods. The beam caught movement for just a second, a shape slipping behind a tree. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. I wanted to call out again, but something stopped me. My gut told me not to. I just backed away slowly, never turning my back on the trees, and sat by the fire again. I kept the knife in my hand, the flashlight in my lap. I sat there for hours listening. At some point, exhaustion won. I dozed off without meaning to. When I woke up, the fire was almost out, and the woods were dark. I sat up fast, heart pounding, but the forest was silent. Too silent. That was when I noticed the footprints, just outside the ring of light from the fire. Bare footprints, deep enough to show the weight of someone heavy. They circled my campsite, once, twice, and then they disappeared back into the woods. I packed up at first light. I wasn't going to stay another night out there. I took a different trail back, moving fast. I wanted to put as much distance as I could between me and whoever had been out there. But the whole way back, I kept hearing it. That faint sound of someone moving in the brush, always just out of sight. It followed me all the way to the trailhead. When I finally made it back to my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors. I sat there for a long time, just breathing. I didn't see anyone on the road out. No cars, no people. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. But I know this, it wasn't an animal. And it wasn't my imagination. I haven't been back since.